There is a clock face on the City Hall Tower in Halifax, Nova Scotia, that never moves. It is fixed at 4 minutes and 35 seconds past 9, but that is not the time the original clock showed after the blast. Witnesses read it near 6 minutes past. The exact second came decades later, from a seismograph record that had been lost in a storeroom in New York. The dial on the tower is not a survivor. It is a monument to a measurement.
And for most of a century, nobody could have told you it was the right time. The moment was argued over for decades. 9:05, 9:06, 9:07, just before 9. It was settled by a piece of paper that had been lost in a storeroom. 2,900 tons of explosive, near enough, in the hold of a ship in a narrow channel, a city at its windows, watching a fire, and a number that, to this day, nobody can give you. Halifax, in 1917, was not a quiet provincial port. It was one of the busiest harbors in the war. Convoys formed there. Troops left from there. Everything crossing the Atlantic for the British war effort came through, and the harbor ran on a schedule that did not much care what was in your hold. 65,000 people lived around it. On the evening of the 5th of December, a French cargo steamer called the Mont Blanc arrived off the harbor mouth. She was too late. The anti-submarine net across the entrance closed for the night, and she anchored outside it until morning. At about 7:30 the next morning, she took on a harbor pilot, a Halifax man named Francis Mackey, and began her run up the channel. Coming the other way was the Emo. She is very often called the Belgian relief ship. She was not Belgian. She was Norwegian registered, chartered for Belgian relief work, with Belgian relief painted along her sides so that a submarine commander might read it and let her pass. She was empty, sailing in ballast, riding high, outbound for New York to load. Between them lay the Narrows. It is exactly what it sounds like. At about 9:15, the Emo cut into the Mont Blanc's starboard bow. That word is going to matter later. Here is the part that turns a shipping accident into the rest of this film. The Mont Blanc was carrying explosives. All of her was carrying explosives, picric acid, which is what a great deal of artillery shell filling was made from, TNT, gun cotton, and benzol, a motor fuel, in drums lashed on the open deck. How much of each is still argued about? One itemized breakdown gives roughly 2,900 tons in total. The Nova Scotia Archives, the province's own archive, says 2,500 tons of high explosive. Other accounts land between those. The Wikipedia article names the substances and gives no tonnages at all. So, roughly 2,500 to 3,000 tons. The manifest still does not agree with itself, a century on, but the tonnage is not the interesting number. Benzol is. It was a late addition. There was no room for it below, because below was full, so it went on deck in drums on top of everything else. When the two ships ground against each other, the drums toppled and split. The spill ran down across the deck, and the steel tore against steel, and steel tearing against steel makes sparks. The fuel that was on the deck, only because there was no space for it below, is what caught fire. Crew of the Mont Blanc understood immediately what they were standing on. They abandoned ship and rowed for the Dartmouth shore, and they were right too. The burning ship, with nobody aboard, drifted across the channel and came to rest against Pier 6 in the north end of Halifax, a district called Richmond. And then the worst thing in this story happened, and it was not an explosion. It was that a burning ship in a harbor is interesting. Work stopped. People came out onto the street. Children on their way to school stood and watched. In the factories and the houses along the waterfront, people went to the windows, the good windows, the big ones, the ones facing the harbor, and they stood at the glass and they looked. That is why so many of the injuries in this film are eye injuries. Somewhere in those minutes, a railway dispatcher called Vincent Coleman was at Richmond Station with the chief clerk, William Lovett. Coleman was 45. An overnight express, train number 10 from St. John, was inbound with nearly 300 passengers aboard. Coleman sent a telegraph message up the line, the words that come down to us, and they come down in more than one version, run something like, "Hold up the train, there is an ammunition ship on fire in the harbor, making for Pier 6, and she will explode. Yes, this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." That is a reconstruction. No original tape and no written copy turned up in the research for this film. The surviving versions differ from one another, and the version most people know is the one from a 60-second television spot. What is documented is this. The conductor of train number 10 reported that although he was running on time, his train was held for 15 minutes at Rockingham, about 6 kilometers out. Historians still argue about whether Coleman's message is why. Coleman and Lovett were both killed. From the collision to what happened next was under 20 minutes. You will read exactly 20, and you will read 18. Neither is knowable. The end of that interval is fixed to the second. The beginning of it is somebody's approximation. At 4 minutes and 35 seconds past 9 in the morning, the Mont Blanc detonated. Plus or minus 10 seconds. And the reason we can say that at all is the piece of paper from the storeroom. There was a seismograph at Dalhousie University. It recorded the shock on paper, the way seismographs did. And then that record was filed and moved and lost for years and eventually found again at a geological observatory in New York by 2 researchers, Alan Ruffman and David Simpson. They corrected for 2 things: the half-second and a bit that the vibration took to travel from the harbor to the instrument, and the fact that the seismograph's own clock was running 10 seconds fast. What was left was a time. It is the single best documented number in the whole event, and it is the one on the tower. The force of it is reckoned at about 2.9 kilotons. That figure is a modern back calculation from a manifest that, as we have established, nobody agrees on. You will hear that this was as powerful as an atomic bomb. It was not. Hiroshima was around 15 kilotons.
This was about a fifth of that. You will also hear it called the largest man-made explosion before the atomic bomb. Major institutions still use that description. Comparisons with the great ammunition disasters of 1944 depend on yield estimates that nobody can settle.
What is true and needs no defending, it was the largest man-made explosion the world had yet seen. 325 acres were flattened. 1,630 homes were destroyed outright. Around 12,000 buildings were damaged. The harbor floor was briefly exposed, and the water came back as a wave that reached as much as 18 meters above the high water mark on the Halifax side, and every window that a person had been standing at came in. About 9,000 people were injured. That figure is a wartime estimate made at the time, never audited. It is what everyone uses, and it is worth knowing it was never a count. The eyes are their own chapter of the medical literature. 12 ophthalmologists treated something in the order of 600 people with eye injuries. Around 250 eyes were surgically removed. Roughly 40 people never saw again. You will find a figure of 5,900 eye injuries repeated in almost every popular retelling of this. It could not be traced to any source at all. The documented numbers are an order of magnitude smaller. The response began before the dust had settled. A relief commission was formed at about midday the same morning, 4 hours or so after the blast, by the lieutenant governor. That commission went on paying pensions to survivors until 1976, and then the next day it snowed. A blizzard came in over a city that had lost 1,630 houses and had 6,000 people with nowhere to sleep. You will see a depth given for that snowfall. It could not be confirmed from anything. So, a blizzard over the ruins the day after. It stopped the search for survivors in the wreckage. It also stopped the trains. On the night of the 6th, the same day, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts put a relief train together and sent it north. It ran into the blizzard. It reached Halifax on the morning of the 8th. Massachusetts sent $750,000 as well, which in 1917 was an enormous sum from one American state to a foreign city it had no obligation to. Halifax has not forgotten it. We will come back to that at the end, and it is the only cheerful thing in this film. Now the hardest part. How many people died? The Nova Scotia Archives keeps a remembrance book, a database of the dead, built name by name. It contains 1,782 names. The Canadian War Museum states that the official death toll was 1,963. Both of those are real institutions publishing carefully. Neither of them is lying, and neither of them is wrong. They are counting different things. Here is how the smaller number was built. It started with a list of 1,535 victims printed in a city directory in 1918. Then Relief Commission records were added, newspapers, church records, cemetery records, and a government register that sat in a vital statistics office until 2004. When it was closed in December 1918, it held 1,631 entries. Every one of those names is a person somebody could still name. And that is exactly why it is the smaller figure. In the north end, Whole households were killed at once. When everybody in a house dies at the same moment, there is nobody left to report them, nobody to answer the census taker, and nobody to put a name into a book. The last body was recovered in the summer of 1919. So, the honest answer is that we do not know how many people died in Halifax that morning. We know 1,782 of them by name, and we know the real figure is higher than that, by an amount nobody will ever establish. February 1918, an inquiry reported. It blamed the Mont Blanc's captain, Aimé Lemaitre. It blamed the pilot, Francis Mackey. And it blamed the Royal Navy's chief examining officer in the harbor, Commander Evan Wyatt. All three were charged with manslaughter and criminal negligence. Mackey was discharged. A judge found the evidence insufficient. Lemaitr's charges were dismissed. Wyatt went to trial in April. It lasted less than a day. He was acquitted. The civil case ran the other way and then turned around. In April 1918, a court found the Mont Blanc entirely at fault. In May 1919, the Supreme Court of Canada found both ships equally to blame. In March 1920, the Privy Council in London upheld that. Equally to blame, which leaves the sentence this film has been walking towards. 1,900 people, near enough, are dead. A district of a city is gone, and nobody was ever convicted of anything. Francis Mackey was never convicted, and he was also never left alone. He was held in jail for 10 days. He was named in the press, and after the charges against him had been dropped, his pilot's license was refused year after year, with his applications frequently not answered at all. He got it back in 1922. The historian Janet Mabey argues that Mackey was made a scapegoat, that blame was steered toward a local pilot and away from the government and a very young Navy. That is her argument, made from the archives, and it is well received. It is not the same thing as a verdict. There were no verdicts. The North End had to be rebuilt from nothing. What went up there was a planned district of poured concrete block, laid out deliberately, with gardens, built to be permanent because what had stood there had proved not to be. People live in it now. It is an ordinary neighborhood in an ordinary city, and that is the whole point of it. The Relief Commission that was formed at midday on the 6th of December kept working for 58 years. Its last job was pensions for people who had been children that morning. 1918, the year after, Halifax sent Boston a Christmas tree. For Massachusetts, for the train that came through the blizzard. The gesture lapsed, the way gestures do. It was revived in 1971, and it has run every year since. Nova Scotia grows a tree, cuts it, and sends it to Boston, where it is lit on the common. It is more than a century old now, this thank you. The people it was addressed to are all dead. It is sent anyway. It is, as far as I can tell, the longest-running apology in reverse in North America. Nobody in Halifax owed Boston anything. They just kept saying thank you.